Today I wanted to talk to you about desoldering, which is the opposite of soldering. That is, instead of installing components onto a board, you want to remove components from the board. And there are several reasons why you'd want to do this. The main reason is because you want to replace a part that's broken, it's not working any longer. Today we're going to be removing some parts from two items. The first is from this board that's already pre-assembled, and I want to remove some of the parts because I want to lower the height profile for my project. And we'll also be removing some wires from this used switch. The tools you'll be using is a soldering iron, solder flux, solder sucker, cleaning brush, some cotton swabs or lint-free cleaning cloths, 91% alcohol, some solder, needle nose pliers and dikes, solder wick, a pair of tweezers, an X-Acto knife or other sharp blade. Let's go ahead and begin with a board. We're going to be removing two of the components from here. One is this power connector, and the second one is this output connector. Now the power connector, we actually have access to the top of the pins, at least somewhat on the side. The output connector, we don't have any access to the pins except for through the bottom. Let's get started with a power connector. Now by looking at the solder, I can tell the solder is non-leaded solder. It has a dull appearance to it, and that's going to make it difficult to remove. So what we're going to do is actually add solder to the joints, but we're going to use leaded solder. This will work itself into the contact leads and allow us to remove the solder from the component. And I'll just continue to add solder onto the component until there's good heat conduction and the entire solder begins to flow. I can now place my solder sucker onto the contact to remove it. I'll go ahead and do the same thing for the bottom. I'm going to add solder to the joint to get the leaded solder mixed in with the non-leaded solder so that it can be easier to remove. As you can see there, we removed a lot of the solder, both from the bottom and from the top. I'll continue to do the same with the other two pins. Now I've removed all the solder I can remove on the first go around, and the component still won't budge. And so what I'm going to continue to do is I'm going to add more solder, and I'm going to take it out. One thing you do have to be mindful is the heat that you're applying to the part. If this pin or contact is connected anywhere else, that it is transferring heat to any other devices in the vicinity. So you want to make sure that you're not applying too much heat to anything that might be damaged by heat. One of the problems that I was experiencing while adding solder to this is that the heat wasn't transferring to the pins, and the way to solve it was just to keep adding solder to it until the heat began to transfer. Well, it looks like that did it, and the part was finally able to come out. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing we did with the last component, which is add solder to it and then remove it with a solder sucker. Now that our components are out, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the solder pads with my soldering iron, and then I'll go ahead and clean that with alcohol. One of the things you do want to be mindful of as you're removing the parts is that you don't want to pull off these pads. Sometimes the boards are not very well made, and when you pull the component off, it'll tear the pad and the trace with it. So you have to be careful with that. And the solder wick is actually very good for picking up the excess solder, any small bits of solder that are stuck on there. That solder is not coming out of that contact pad, so I'm going to go ahead and take it off with my solder sucker. Now that all the components are off and all the solder is off, I can go ahead and clean this with alcohol. I'll put it in a little tray and bathe it in alcohol, clean it off with a brush. You can go ahead and clean off the alcohol with a cotton swab or any other towel that is lint free. And of course, please do be mindful of any components that are static sensitive. I'm going to go ahead and give this a second go around with some more alcohol and another cotton swab. You do want to make sure not to turn it on with the alcohol still wet. You can dry it off with a heat gun or just wait till the alcohol evaporates off by itself. The process for our switch is pretty much the same, so I'm just going to go ahead and heat it up and use my solder sucker to take it off. Although I was able to take off some of the solder, I'm not getting any more heat conduction between my soldering iron and my wire in contact. So I'm going to go ahead and add more solder to it. With the new solder added, I can go ahead and take the solder off. Now that the wire is pretty much loose, I'm going to go ahead and clip off the wire, although I could have done this from the very beginning. And there you have it. Our first wire is off. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up by using the solder wick to reflow the solder over this contact. And when that's done, I'll go ahead and clean that with alcohol. I'll go ahead and clean that off with a cotton swab. This one here has some heat shrink attached to it, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that open to expose the solder pad. This time around, let's go ahead and cut the wire off first. Let's try using our solder wick. You have to let it sit there a second till that solder flows. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of flex to my solder wick just so it draws out the solder a little bit better. There's still a bit of a wire stuck in there, so I'm just going to snip that off. Now I'll just clean that contact with alcohol. And swipe that down with a cotton swab. That wraps it up. My board is ready to be used in my project, and I can reuse this old switch again. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and you learned something new.